In the quiet hours of the night, as the world slows and thoughts begin to drift, we travel back more than 2 centuries to a vast and restless land known as colonial America. Along the eastern edge of North America, 13 British colonies stretched from the rocky coasts of New England to the warm plantations of Georgia. Forests seemed endless, rivers moved calmly toward the sea, and small towns glowed softly by candlelight. Life here felt distant from the centers of power, yet the influence of a faraway empire shaped every moment of daily existence. These colonies belonged to Great Britain, the most powerful empire of the 18th century. The British flag flew above harbors and government buildings, a symbol of royal authority and imperial order. Colonists spoke the king's language, followed English law, and considered themselves loyal subjects of the crown. For many years, this relationship felt natural and even comforting. Britain provided protection, trade networks, and a shared identity that connected the colonies to a wider world, yet beneath this calm surface, quiet tensions were already forming. The Atlantic Ocean separated the colonies from London by thousands of miles, and this distance shaped a unique colonial spirit. Decisions affecting everyday life were made by officials who had never walked colonial streets or felt American winters. Over time, colonists learned to rely on themselves. Local assemblies governed towns, farmers worked their own land, and merchants built independent trade networks. Slowly, without dramatic announcements or grand declarations, a sense of autonomy began to grow. Daily life in the colonies varied widely depending on location. In New England, small farms and busy ports supported communities built around churches and town meetings. The Middle Colonies, including New York and Pennsylvania, thrived on trade, diversity, and fertile farmland. In the Southern colonies, large plantations depended on enslaved labor, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo for export. Though different in character, all colonies shared one thing: a growing belief that they understood their own needs better than distant rulers ever could. For much of the early 18th century, Britain paid little attention to this quiet independence. The empire was focused on wars in Europe and competition with France and Spain across the globe. Colonial assemblies handled local affairs, and British laws were often loosely enforced. This period of relative freedom allowed colonial economies to grow and local political traditions to strengthen. Many historians later called this time salutary neglect, a relaxed approach that unintentionally encouraged self-rule. Everything changed after the French and Indian War, a global conflict that ended in 1763. Britain emerged victorious, gaining vast new territories in North America. But victory came at a great cost. The war had drained the British treasury, leaving the government deep in debt. British leaders looked across the Atlantic and saw the colonies as a logical source of revenue. After all, they argued, the war had been fought largely to protect colonial lands. New laws and taxes soon followed, reaching into the daily lives of ordinary colonists. The Sugar Act placed duties on imported goods. The Stamp Act required official stamps on newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. For the first time, taxes were imposed directly on the colonies by Parliament, where colonists had no elected representatives. The phrase "no taxation without representation" began to echo through taverns, meeting halls, and private homes. Resistance did not begin with violence, but with words and ideas. Pamphlets circulated quietly, questioning Parliament's authority. Public meetings grew more frequent, and debates stretched late into the night. Colonists argued that their rights as Englishmen were being violated. They believed taxation required consent, and consent required representation. These ideas, rooted in Enlightenment philosophy, spread slowly but steadily through society. British officials were often surprised by the intensity of colonial opposition. From their perspective, the taxes were modest and reasonable. From the colonial point of view, they represented a dangerous precedent. If Parliament could tax without consent, what limits existed on its power? This question lingered in the minds of merchants, farmers, lawyers, and printers alike. As midnight approached in colonial towns, candles burned low while conversations continued in hushed tones. Few colonists imagined independence at this stage. Most still hoped for reconciliation, believing the empire could be repaired through compromise. Yet the relationship between Britain and its colonies had undeniably shifted. Trust was fading, and a quiet sense of unease settled over the land. The stage was being set for a transformation no one could fully predict. What began as a dispute over taxes and authority would soon grow into something far greater. As the night deepens and history breathes softly around us, we sense the first stirring of a revolution that would change the course of the world. As the night grows deeper and the mind begins to relax, we return once more to colonial America, where the soft glow of lantern light reveals a society slowly awakening to its own voice. The disputes that once seemed distant and theoretical were now entering everyday conversations. Taxes, laws, and imperial authority were no longer abstract ideas discussed only by politicians. They were becoming personal, shaping the choices and emotions of ordinary men and women across the colonies. The repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766 briefly eased tensions. Church bells rang, celebrations filled the streets, and many colonists believed harmony with Britain had been restored. Yet this relief was short-lived. Alongside repeal came the Declaratory Act, in which Parliament firmly stated its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Beneath the cheers and celebrations, a quiet concern lingered. The fundamental question of power had not been resolved. Soon, new measures arrived. The Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. These items were woven into daily colonial life, and their taxation was impossible to ignore. Merchants felt the pressure first, watching profits shrink and customers grow uneasy. Housewives discussed prices in markets, and dockworkers whispered about politics as ships unloaded cargo from Britain. Resistance took on a more organized and disciplined form. Non-importation agreements spread from colony to colony, encouraging people to boycott British goods. Choosing what not to buy became a quiet but powerful act of protest. Homespun clothing replaced imported fabrics, and simplicity became a symbol of principle. These everyday choices bound communities together in shared purpose, even as they deepened divisions with loyalist neighbors who still supported the crown. Words continued to play a central role in shaping the movement. Newspapers and pamphlets multiplied, their pages filled with essays defending colonial rights. Writers argued calmly, logically, and persistently, drawing on English legal traditions and Enlightenment philosophy. They did not yet call for independence, but they demanded respect, fairness, and constitutional limits on power. Ideas traveled faster than ever before, carried by riders along dusty roads and by ships moving quietly between ports. British officials responded with firmness rather than compromise. To enforce the new laws, customs officers were sent to colonial ports, and British troops began arriving in greater numbers. Red-coated soldiers became a common sight in cities like Boston, their presence both reassuring to loyalists and deeply unsettling to others. The sight of armed troops enforcing civil law stirred old fears about tyranny and standing armies. Boston soon emerged as the center of resistance and tension. Narrow streets echoed with arguments, while docks buzzed with rumor and resentment. Soldiers and civilians lived side by side, sharing space but not trust. Small confrontations became frequent, born from insults, misunderstandings, and long-held frustrations. Each incident added another layer of strain to an already fragile relationship. On a cold evening in March 1770, tension finally broke. A confrontation between British soldiers and colonial townspeople escalated into violence. Shots rang out in the night air, and 5 colonists lay dead. The event would become known as the Boston Massacre. Though limited in scale, its emotional impact was enormous. Engravings and accounts spread rapidly, portraying the soldiers as brutal oppressors and the victims as martyrs to liberty. In the aftermath, colonial leaders worked carefully to prevent further bloodshed. Soldiers were withdrawn from the city, and calm slowly returned. Yet the memory of the massacre lingered, a quiet reminder of how fragile peace had become. Trust, once damaged, proved difficult to restore. For a time, tensions eased again. Many Townshend duties were repealed, except for one, the tax on tea. This small but symbolic tax would soon carry enormous consequences. Tea was more than a beverage, it was a daily ritual, shared in homes across the colonies. By keeping the tax, Parliament sent a clear message that it had not abandoned its claim to authority. As years passed, a new generation of colonial leaders emerged, skilled in organization and communication. Committees of correspondence formed, linking towns and colonies through regular letters. News, ideas, and warnings flowed steadily, creating a shared sense of identity among people who had never met. These networks quietly prepared the colonies for coordinated action, even as daily life continued its familiar rhythms. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the British East India Company special privileges. Though it lowered the price of tea, it reinforced Parliament's right to tax. Many colonists saw it as a clever trap, tempting them to accept a principle they firmly rejected. Resistance flared once more, focused now on ships carrying tea into colonial ports. In Boston, the response would be dramatic and unforgettable. Yet even before that night arrived, the colonies stood at a crossroads. Some still hoped for compromise, others began to imagine separation, and many simply felt uncertainty about the future. As the hour grows late and history speaks in softer tones, we sense that peaceful protest is giving way to something more decisive. The path ahead is narrowing, and the calm before a storm settles gently over the land. As the night air grows still and the world outside fades into silence, we drift back to the colonial port of Boston, where events are quietly moving toward a decisive moment. The tension that had built over years of debate, protest, and restraint now rested heavily upon the city. Ships sat anchored in the harbor, their holds filled with chests of tea, waiting patiently as the deadline for payment drew near. Every passing day felt heavier than the last. The Tea Act of 1773 had stirred anger not because it raised prices, but because it challenged principles. By allowing the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, Parliament sought to rescue a struggling corporation while reinforcing its authority to tax. Many colonists saw this as a dangerous test. If they accepted the tea, they accepted Parliament's right to rule without consent. Quiet meetings filled Boston as leaders searched for a response that would be firm yet controlled. On a cold December night, men gathered in secrecy. Disguised as Native Americans, not to mock but to conceal their identities, they moved silently toward the docks. There was no shouting, no chaos, only purposeful motion under a moonlit sky. One by one, tea chests were opened and emptied into the dark water below. The harbor absorbed the leaves without resistance, waves closing gently over what had become a powerful symbol of defiance. The Boston Tea Party shocked Britain. News crossed the Atlantic slowly, but when it arrived, it was met with outrage. British leaders viewed the act not as protest, but as destruction of property and open rebellion. Patience, already worn thin, vanished entirely. Parliament responded with a series of harsh measures meant to punish Massachusetts and restore order through force. These laws, known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, altered daily life almost overnight. Boston Harbor was closed, cutting off trade and livelihoods. The Massachusetts Charter was rewritten, limiting self-government. British officials accused of crimes were to be tried elsewhere, beyond the reach of colonial courts. To many colonists, these acts felt like collective punishment, imposed without regard for justice or fairness. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies in sympathy and concern. Food and supplies were sent to Boston from distant towns. Letters of support crossed colony borders. What had once been separate disputes now felt shared. Colonists began to understand that the fate of one colony could soon become the fate of all. In response, colonial leaders called for a gathering unlike any before. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. They arrived by horse and carriage, carrying instructions from their home assemblies. Some hoped for reconciliation, others believed firmer action was required. All understood the gravity of the moment. The Congress moved carefully. Delegates debated late into the evenings, balancing loyalty to the Crown with defense of colonial rights. They agreed to renew boycotts of British goods and drafted petitions to the King, respectfully outlining their grievances. At the same time, they encouraged colonies to prepare local militias, not for rebellion, but for defense. The language remained cautious, yet the preparations spoke quietly of uncertainty ahead. while leaders debated, ordinary colonists took action. Militia units, known as Minutemen, trained regularly, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Farmers practiced drills in open fields, muskets resting against fence posts. These preparations were not loud or dramatic, but steady and deliberate, woven into the rhythms of everyday life. British authorities grew increasingly alarmed. General Thomas Gage, governor of Massachusetts, was ordered to restore order and assert royal authority. He fortified positions in Boston and monitored colonial activities closely. The distance between compromise and confrontation narrowed with each passing week. By early 1775, rumors traveled faster than official orders. Whispers of weapon stockpiles and secret plans spread through taverns and meeting houses. Both sides watched each other carefully, uncertain who would make the first move. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. In April, British troops quietly prepared to march from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission was to seize colonial military supplies and arrest key leaders. Under cover of darkness, soldiers set out along familiar roads, unaware that colonial riders were already spreading the alarm. As dawn approached, the long-standing dispute between empire and colony stood on the edge of transformation. The arguments of pamphlets and petitions were about to meet the reality of armed conflict. As we rest within this quiet moment, history holds its breath. The path forward is no longer shaped only by words, but by actions that will echo across generations. As the first light of dawn gently touches the quiet countryside of Massachusetts, we arrive at a moment where history begins to move not through speeches or letters, but through action. The villages of Lexington and Concord lie peacefully among rolling fields and budding trees, unaware that they are about to enter the memory of the world. Birds stir softly in the morning air as armed men, both colonial and British, approach one another with uncertainty and resolve. In the early hours of April 19, 1775, British troops reached the village green in Lexington. Colonial militia members stood waiting, outnumbered and unsure of the soldiers' intentions. No clear order to fire was given, and even now, history cannot say with certainty who fired the first shot. What is known is that a brief exchange of gunfire shattered the morning stillness. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay wounded or dead. The British troops moved on, but something irreversible had begun. At Concord, the confrontation continued. Colonial militias gathered in greater numbers, drawn by alarm riders and church bells. At the North Bridge, they advanced steadily, muskets raised, hearts pounding. This time, the colonists returned fire with purpose. British soldiers fell back, surprised by the resistance. The balance of confidence began to shift, quietly but unmistakably. As British troops retreated toward Boston, they faced continuous resistance along the road. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers emerged from behind trees, stone walls, and barns. The fighting was scattered and chaotic, yet deeply personal. The land itself seemed to rise in defense of those who lived upon it. By the time the soldiers reached the safety of Boston, the cost of the march was clear. The colonies had shown they were willing to fight. News of the battle spread rapidly. Riders carried word from town to town, and within days, thousands of militia members surrounded Boston. What followed was not yet a formal war, but a tense standoff. The British Army remained confined within the city, while colonial forces formed a loose siege around it. The sound of distant drums and the sight of campfires became part of the landscape. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Delegates faced decisions that could no longer be delayed. Armed conflict had begun, yet many still hoped for peace. After long debate, Congress took responsibility for the militia forces and created a Continental Army. Leadership of this new force was entrusted to George Washington, a respected Virginian known for calm authority and quiet strength. Washington arrived in Cambridge that summer to take command. He found an army in spirit but not in structure. Supplies were scarce, training uneven, and discipline fragile. Yet beneath these challenges lay determination. Men from different colonies, speaking with different accents and holding different customs, now shared a common purpose. Slowly, order began to replace improvisation. Meanwhile, British commanders sought to break the siege of Boston. In June, they planned an assault on nearby high ground overlooking the city. Colonial forces moved quickly to fortify Breed's Hill, near Bunker Hill. Through the night, they dug earthworks, working silently beneath the stars. When morning came, British troops advanced uphill in disciplined lines. The fighting that followed was fierce and costly. Colonial forces, low on ammunition, waited until the enemy was close before firing. Though the British eventually took the hill, their losses were heavy. The battle demonstrated that colonial soldiers could stand against one of the world's strongest armies. The impact of Bunker Hill reached far beyond Boston. In Britain, leaders were stunned by the resistance. In the colonies, confidence grew. This was no longer a protest movement. It was becoming a revolution in fact, if not yet in name. Even as fighting continued, the colonies made one final attempt at reconciliation. The Olive Branch Petition was sent to King George III, expressing loyalty while requesting relief from oppressive policies. The petition was never answered. Instead, the king declared the colonies in rebellion. As summer deepened and camps settled into routine, both sides prepared for a long struggle. What had begun with a single, uncertain shot had grown into a widening conflict. As we rest in this moment of quiet resolve, we sense that the world has shifted. The road ahead will be difficult and uncertain, but it is now clearly marked by sacrifice, endurance, and the steady march of history. As night settles gently over the colonies and the distant sounds of marching fade into memory, our journey turns inward, toward ideas rather than battles. By the winter of 1775 and the early months of 1776, the American Revolution was no longer only a military struggle. It had become a quiet contest of belief, asking ordinary people to imagine a future they had never known. The question before them was simple yet profound: could these colonies stand alone? For many, the thought of independence still felt unsettling. Loyalty to the king had been woven into daily life for generations. Portraits of George III hung in public spaces, and prayers for the monarch were spoken in churches. Even as fighting continued, a large portion of the population hoped the conflict might end with reconciliation. The idea of breaking completely from Britain felt like stepping into darkness without a map. Into this uncertainty came a small pamphlet with a powerful voice. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. Written in plain language and meant for ordinary readers, it challenged long-held assumptions about monarchy and empire. Paine argued that an island should not rule a continent, and that hereditary power contradicted natural reason. His words were firm but accessible, carrying revolutionary ideas into homes, taverns, and workshops. Common Sense spread rapidly, read aloud in groups and discussed late into the night. For many colonists, it clarified feelings they had struggled to express. Independence was no longer a distant or radical notion. It became a logical conclusion to years of tension and sacrifice. Quietly, the center of public opinion began to shift. At the same time, events pushed the colonies further apart from Britain. King George III's rejection of the Olive Branch Petition confirmed what many had begun to suspect. In August 1775, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. This proclamation hardened attitudes on both sides. What remained of hope for compromise slowly faded. The Second Continental Congress returned to Philadelphia in the spring of 1776 with a growing sense of urgency. Delegates arrived aware that history was pressing in on them. Provincial assemblies had begun instructing their representatives to consider independence. The moment they had long postponed was now unavoidable. A small committee was formed to draft a formal statement explaining the colony's decision to the world. Thomas Jefferson took on the primary task of writing. Working quietly in a rented room, he drew upon Enlightenment philosophy, colonial grievances, and a deep belief in human equality. His words were meant not only to justify separation, but to define a new set of ideals. The document he produced spoke of natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It argued that governments existed to protect these rights, and that when they failed, the people had the authority to alter or abolish them. These ideas were not entirely new, but never before had they been declared so clearly or so boldly. Congress debated the draft carefully, editing language and weighing consequences. Some phrases were softened, others removed, yet the heart of the message remained. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4, the final text was formally adopted. That evening, church bells rang in Philadelphia. Bonfires were lit, and quiet celebrations spread through the city. Yet alongside relief and pride, there was awareness of the cost ahead. By declaring independence, the colonies had committed themselves fully to war against a powerful empire. There would be no turning back. Copies of the Declaration were sent throughout the colonies. In town squares and meeting houses, it was read aloud to gathered crowds. Some listened in silence, others with tears, and many with cautious hope. The words named a new identity, transforming subjects into citizens and resistance into purpose. Not everyone welcomed the Declaration. Loyalists feared chaos and loss, while enslaved people recognized the painful contradiction between the language of liberty and their own condition. Women, too, understood that equality remained incomplete. The ideals of independence shone brightly, even as their full meaning remained unfinished. Across the Atlantic, Britain received the Declaration with disbelief and anger. The conflict was no longer a rebellion to be contained, but a war against a self-declared nation. Foreign powers watched closely, weighing whether this bold experiment might succeed. As the summer of 1776 unfolded, the colonies stood on uncertain ground. They had declared themselves free, but freedom still had to be defended. As we rest within this quiet moment of reflection, we sense that something lasting has been born, not only a nation, but an idea that will continue to echo long after the sound of muskets has faded into the night. As the long days of summer fade and cooler winds move softly across the land, the young American cause enters one of its most uncertain chapters. Independence has been declared, but the reality of war now presses heavily upon the colonies. Hope, once bright and confident, begins to flicker as the British Empire turns its full attention toward crushing the rebellion. In the summer of 1776, British forces launched a powerful campaign to seize New York City. Their army was large, disciplined, and supported by the strongest navy in the world. George Washington and the Continental Army were brave but inexperienced, facing shortages of supplies, training, and reliable funding. The contrast between the two forces was stark and sobering. The Battle of Long Island marked a painful beginning. British troops outmaneuvered the Continental Army, forcing Washington into a difficult retreat. Losses mounted, and morale sank. Yet under cover of night and fog, Washington managed a quiet and skillful evacuation across the East River, saving his army from destruction. It was not a victory, but it was survival. New York soon fell to the British, becoming their central base of operations. Fires swept through the city, leaving ruins behind and deepening civilian suffering. For many colonists, the war suddenly felt closer and more personal. Loyalists and patriots lived side by side, divided by fear and uncertainty. As autumn turned to winter, the Continental Army retreated across New Jersey. Soldiers marched with worn boots, thin coats, and fading spirits. Enlistments expired, and desertions increased. Some questioned whether independence had been declared too soon, whether the cost was simply too great. In these dark days, Thomas Paine once again lent his voice to the cause. His pamphlet series The American Crisis opened with words meant to steady the heart: "These are the times that try men's souls." The message was clear: perseverance, not comfort, would determine the future. Washington ordered the pamphlet read aloud to his troops, its words echoing quietly through winter camps. British commanders believed the rebellion was nearing its end. Their troops settled into winter quarters, confident that the Continental Army would soon dissolve. Yet Washington was not ready to surrender the moment or the cause. He understood that a bold action, even a small one, could restore belief. On a cold Christmas night in December 1776, Washington led his army across the icy Delaware River. Snow and sleet cut through the darkness as soldiers struggled forward, carrying muskets and hope in equal measure. The crossing was dangerous and exhausting, but the element of surprise remained intact. At dawn, the Continental Army attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The battle was brief but decisive. The stunned defenders surrendered, and for the first time in many months, the Americans tasted victory. The psychological impact was immense. News of the triumph spread quickly, lifting spirits across the colonies. Just days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. Though smaller in scale, the victory reinforced the sense that the American cause was still alive. These successes did not end the war, but they changed its direction. Confidence slowly returned, and enlistments increased. Winter camps followed, offering little comfort. Soldiers endured cold nights, limited rations, and constant uncertainty. Yet shared hardship strengthened bonds. Men from different colonies learned to rely on one another, united not by comfort, but by commitment. Across the Atlantic, foreign powers watched closely. France, long a rival of Britain, saw opportunity in America's persistence. Though not yet openly allied, French support began quietly, through supplies, money, and encouragement. The struggle was no longer entirely isolated. By the spring of 1777, the revolution had survived its most fragile moment. It remained far from secure, but it endured. The war would continue with new challenges and shifting fortunes. As we rest within this season of quiet resilience, we sense that endurance itself has become a form of victory. In the hush of winter's end, the American cause breathes on, wounded, weary, yet unbroken. And in that persistence lies the promise of what is still to come. As gentle evening shadows stretch across the encampments and the sounds of distant marching soften into memory, the American Revolution enters a new and hopeful phase. The war has survived its harshest trials, and though victory remains uncertain, the balance is slowly beginning to shift. The year is 1777, and the struggle for independence is about to draw the attention of the wider world. British leaders believed that a decisive campaign could end the rebellion. Their plan centered on isolating New England, long considered the heart of resistance. By controlling the Hudson River Valley, British forces hoped to divide the colonies and weaken coordination among them. The strategy seemed sound on paper, carefully designed and confidently supported. One British army, led by General John Burgoyne, began marching south from Canada. His troops moved deliberately through dense forests and along winding rivers, carrying supplies and expectations of success. Yet the American landscape proved difficult, slowing progress and stretching supply lines. Local militias harassed the march, disappearing into forests as quietly as they appeared. Meanwhile, coordination among British commanders faltered. Expected support from other armies failed to arrive, leaving Burgoyne increasingly isolated. American forces, growing in confidence and organization, gathered near the small town of Saratoga in New York. Farmers, soldiers, and volunteers converged, united by purpose and opportunity. In September and October of 1777, two major battles unfolded near Saratoga. American troops, entrenched and determined, resisted repeated British assaults. The fighting was intense but measured, shaped by terrain and endurance rather than dramatic charges. Slowly, the British position weakened. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. The victory at Saratoga marked a profound turning point in the war. It proved that the Continental Army could defeat a major British force in open battle. More importantly, it changed how the world viewed the American cause. Across the Atlantic, France watched closely. Long a rival of Britain, France had quietly supported the colonies with supplies and money. Saratoga convinced French leaders that American independence was not only possible, but likely. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States. The alliance transformed the conflict. What had begun as a colonial rebellion became an international war. French naval power challenged British dominance at sea, while troops and advisors crossed the Atlantic to support the Continental Army. Among them was the Marquis de Lafayette, whose youthful idealism and commitment symbolized the growing bond between nations. The presence of France lifted American morale. Soldiers who had once felt alone now sensed global support behind their cause. British strategy, once confident, grew more cautious as resources were stretched across multiple fronts, from the Caribbean to Europe, yet the war remained far from easy. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army settled into camp at Valley Forge. Conditions were harsh. Snow covered the ground, food was scarce, and disease spread through crowded huts. Suffering was constant, but the army did not dissolve. At Valley Forge, transformation took place quietly. Under the guidance of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, soldiers received systematic training. Discipline improved, drills became precise, and confidence grew. What emerged in the spring was not merely a surviving force, but a professional army. As winter loosened its grip, the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge stronger than before. When they later met British troops at Monmouth, they held their ground with renewed skill and determination. The result was not a decisive victory, but it confirmed that American forces had matured. The war's focus gradually shifted southward, where Britain hoped to rally Loyalist support. Yet even as strategies changed, the larger meaning of Saratoga and the French alliance endured. The revolution had gained legitimacy, strength, and time. As night deepens and the rhythm of history slows once more, we pause at this moment of turning. The path ahead remains uncertain, marked by sacrifice and endurance. But the tide has shifted. The struggle for independence is no longer a solitary dream, but a shared endeavor carried forward by many hands, across oceans and generations. As the night grows quieter and the pace of history slows once more, the American Revolution turns its attention southward. After years of fighting in the northern colonies, British leaders believed the war could still be won by shifting strategy. The southern colonies, they hoped, held large numbers of loyalists who would rise in support of the crown. With this belief, the conflict entered a new and more complex phase. The southern landscape differed greatly from the north. Vast plantations, winding rivers, dense forests, and scattered settlements shaped both daily life and military strategy. Control of this region depended not only on armies, but on alliances with civilians whose loyalties were often divided. Neighbors found themselves on opposite sides, and the war took on a deeply personal character. British forces first found success. In late 1778, they captured Savannah, Georgia, followed by Charleston, South Carolina, in 1780. The fall of Charleston was a devastating blow to the American cause, resulting in one of the largest Continental Army surrenders of the war. For a time, it seemed as though British strategy might succeed after all, yet holding territory proved far more difficult than capturing it. American resistance in the South rarely took the form of large, formal battles. Instead, it emerged through small engagements, ambushes, and swift movements. Local militia leaders such as Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, used the terrain to their advantage, striking quickly and disappearing just as fast. This style of warfare exhausted British troops and undermined their control. Roads were unsafe, supply lines were fragile, and Loyalist support proved less reliable than expected. The war became a test of endurance, fought not only on battlefields, but in farms, villages, and wilderness paths. In the midst of this struggle, British command passed to General Charles Cornwallis. Seeking a decisive victory, he moved northward through the Carolinas, clashing repeatedly with American forces. Some encounters favored the British, others the Americans, but each battle drained strength from both sides. One of the most significant engagements occurred at Kings Mountain in October 1780. There, American frontier fighters defeated a Loyalist force in a fierce and fast-moving battle. The victory shattered British hopes of widespread Loyalist uprising and renewed American confidence in the South. Gradually, American leadership stabilized. General Nathanael Greene adopted a strategy of avoidance and attrition, choosing when to fight and when to withdraw. Rather than seeking immediate victory, Greene aimed to wear down British forces over time. His approach required patience, sacrifice, and trust in the long arc of endurance. Battles such as Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse followed. Though not always clear victories, they inflicted heavy losses on British troops. Cornwallis found himself weakened, forced to reconsider his position and supply needs. The Southern Campaign, meant to secure victory, began instead to narrow British options. As the war continued, the toll on civilians deepened. Farms were destroyed, families displaced, and communities fractured. Enslaved people faced uncertain futures, as both sides offered freedom in exchange for service, often without fulfillment. The promises of liberty echoed unevenly across the landscape. By 1781, Cornwallis moved his army toward the coast, seeking resupply and support from the British Navy. He established a fortified position at Yorktown, Virginia, believing it to be secure. Yet this decision would soon draw together the many threads of the long conflict. Unbeknownst to him, American and French forces were coordinating quietly. Washington, still watchful in the north, recognized opportunity. French naval power, so long hoped for, was finally in position to challenge Britain at SEA.AS. Summer turned toward autumn, armies shifted with purpose. The slow southern road, marked by hardship and resilience, was guiding the revolution toward its final and defining moment. As we pause here, wrapped in the calm rhythm of history, we sense that the long struggle is nearing its resolution, not through sudden triumph, but through steady perseverance. As the final year of the war unfolds, the pace of events seems to slow, as though history itself is moving with deliberate care. The long struggle for independence, marked by endurance and sacrifice, now draws its many threads together along the gentle shores of Virginia. The town of Yorktown rests quietly beside the Chesapeake Bay, unaware that it is about to witness the closing chapter of a revolution. British General Charles Cornwallis had chosen Yorktown as a defensive position, believing it secure. His army settled behind earthworks, waiting for resupply and reinforcement by sea. From the landward side, the position appeared strong. From the water, however, events were already turning against him. In September 1781, a powerful French fleet arrived in the Chesapeake. Under the command of Admiral de Grasse, French ships challenged British naval control and emerged victorious in a crucial engagement. The sea route Cornwallis depended upon was suddenly closed. The quiet dominance of the French Navy transformed the situation without dramatic announcement. At the same time, American and French armies moved with careful coordination. George Washington, long focused on New York, quietly shifted his forces southward. Alongside him marched French troops under General Rochambeau. Their movement was deliberate and discreet, designed to conceal their true objective until it was too late to respond. By late September, Allied forces surrounded Yorktown. Trenches were dug methodically, inching closer to British lines each night. Cannon fire echoed across the fields, steady rather than frantic. The siege unfolded with patience and precision, reflecting years of hard-earned experience. Inside the British defenses, conditions worsened. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered, and hope faded with each passing day. Attempts to break out or escape by sea failed. Cornwallis waited, watching the horizon for sails that never appeared. On October 19, 1781, the inevitable arrived. British forces marched out and formally surrendered. The ceremony was solemn and restrained. There were no cheers, no celebrations of conquest, only quiet recognition that the war's decisive moment had passed. The surrender at Yorktown did not immediately end the war, but it effectively sealed its outcome. News traveled slowly across the Atlantic, yet when it reached Britain, the response was profound. Support for continuing the war collapsed. The cost had become too great, and the purpose too uncertain. Fighting gradually diminished. Armies remained in place, but large-scale operations faded. In America, attention turned cautiously toward the future. Communities began the slow process of recovery, even as political questions remained unresolved. Peace negotiations began in earnest in 1782. American representatives, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, traveled to Paris. There, in quiet rooms far from the battlefields, the final shape of independence was discussed and defined. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. The long war was officially over. What had once seemed impossible had become reality through patience, cooperation, and resolve. As British troops departed American cities, the mood was mixed. Relief blended with exhaustion. Victory carried no triumphal roar, only a deep and steady calm. The cost of independence was remembered even as its promise began to unfold. George Washington soon resigned his military commission, returning power to civilian leadership. His actions spoke quietly of the values the revolution sought to uphold. Authority, once challenged, was now willingly laid down. As we rest within this final movement of the war, the sounds of marching fade into memory. The revolution concludes not with thunder, but with stillness. A new nation stands at the edge of its future, shaped by struggle, sustained by hope, and guided by lessons learned in the long night of history. As the long night of war finally gives way to a quieter morning, the story of the American Revolution enters its final, reflective chapter. The muskets have fallen silent, armies have dispersed, and the land slowly exhales after years of tension. What remains is not the noise of battle, but the softer, more enduring work of building a nation. In towns and countryside alike, life resumes its familiar rhythms. Farmers return to their fields, merchants reopen shops, and families gather again around hearths once left cold by absence. Yet nothing is quite the same. The colonies are now the United States, bound together by shared sacrifice rather than imperial rule. Independence, once an idea debated in pamphlets and halls, has become a living reality. The challenges ahead are immense. The new nation is fragile, burdened by debt, regional differences, and unanswered questions about governance. Under the Articles of Confederation, power rests largely with the individual states. This loose structure reflects deep caution towards centralized authority, born from long resistance to imperial control. Cooperation is difficult, and unity must be learned slowly. George Washington's decision to step away from power sets a powerful example. By returning to private life, he affirms that the revolution was not fought to replace one ruler with another, but to establish a government accountable to the people. His quiet departure from public command resonates deeply, shaping expectations for leadership in the years to come. Attention soon turns toward creating a stronger and more balanced system of government. In 1787, delegates gather once more in Philadelphia, this time not to resist authority, but to design it. The Constitutional Convention unfolds behind closed doors, filled with careful debate and compromise. Voices differ sharply, yet a shared commitment to stability guides the discussion. The Constitution that emerges is both practical and visionary. It divides power among branches, balances state and federal authority, and seeks to prevent tyranny through structure rather than force. Ratification is not immediate or unanimous. Citizens argue passionately in newspapers and meetings, weighing liberty against order. To address lingering fears, the Bill of Rights is added. These first 10 amendments promise protections for speech, religion, assembly, and due process. They echo the same concerns that once fueled resistance to British rule, now transformed into guiding principles for self-government. Beyond laws and institutions, the revolution leaves a broader legacy. It reshapes how people think about authority, rights, and identity. Across the world, observers take note. In Europe and beyond, reformers and revolutionaries draw inspiration from the American example, seeing proof that change is possible, yet the story remains incomplete. The ideals of liberty and equality are not fully realized. Enslaved people remain in bondage, women are excluded from political life, and indigenous nations face displacement. These contradictions rest uneasily alongside revolutionary promises, reminding future generations that independence is a beginning, not an ending. Over time, the meaning of the revolution continues to evolve. Each generation returns to its founding ideas, questioning, refining, and expanding them. The revolution's true power lies not only in what it achieved, but in what it set in motion, an ongoing conversation about freedom and responsibility. As the nation grows, the memory of the revolution softens into history. Battlefields become quiet fields once more. Letters, journals, and monuments preserve echoes of the past. The struggles of ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, printers, and families, remain woven into the fabric of the country they helped create. Now, as we come to rest at the end of this journey, the night feels calm again. The epic struggle that began with distant grievances and uncertain hope settles into reflection. The American Revolution closes not with a final clash, but with a continuing promise. In this stillness, we remember that history is not only shaped by great events, but by patience, perseverance, and the quiet courage to imagine a different future. And as sleep gently arrives, the story lingers on, a steady echo of liberty carried forward through time.